Several years ago, I purchased a sign that I posted on my bedroom wall that said this: there is always, always, always something to be thankful for. There is always, always, always something to be thankful for. Now, I have to say, I didn't purchase this sign during a time when life was going particularly smoothly. In fact, it was a time where I was feeling rather stressed and needed to be reminded of an attitude of thankfulness and a story that was bigger than my immediate moment. It was not a sign that I put on the wall to encourage me to pick myself up by my bootstraps or to inspire me to break out into a chorus of "Don't worry, be happy." Instead, it did remind me that God's work had happened before me, God's work was continuing, and God's work would happen long beyond this immediate, stressful, and difficult moment. I believe that's the practice that the psalmist was engaged in that we heard today, as he was telling the story of God's faithfulness in the past, while acknowledging that there were challenges in the present. We don't know what those challenges were, they're not delineated, but something was amiss and something was terribly stressful. He talks about sowing in tears, not sure of the effectiveness of the seeds, not sure of the favor of the weather, but anticipating with certainty the harvesting with shouts of joy, whenever that might occur. You see, sowing for the future, when the present is filled with fear and despair, is part of how we practice living into the faithfulness of God. We look to the past to help us anticipate the future and guide our actions for the present. That's true for us in times of grief, is true for us in times of depression, times of illness, times of fear, times when our nation seems in turmoil or there's communal unrest, times of uncertainty and anxiety in whatever forms they might present themselves. We remember God's faithfulness in the past to help us live into God's faithfulness in the future. And to live in the present, then, expectant, open to possibilities, and walking into new ways of being. You see, there's power. There's power in being those who have a dream for a hope-filled future. One of the most convincing stories of that comes from Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a survivor of the Holocaust, and he observed with those that he was with who were suffering such unspeakable horrors. There were some who were able to tolerate this and endure, when others were moved to despair and seemed to have no energy to fight. He was curious about what it was about those who were able to keep going in the face of such terrible experiences. And he found a common thread when he talked to these folks after they had survived those terrible times. What he learned was the ones who had seemed to be able to be resilient were those who had a hope, a dream for the future, a sense that life would be continuing beyond the present moment, that God was still active and leading them on into their future. They were the ones who had the resilience to face the deepest, darkest nights of the soul. I watched this play out several years ago in a Ugandan children's choir. Now, these were children who were orphaned. They had lost their parents to warfare, to AIDS, to illness of various kinds. They were in a school because they had nowhere else to be. They had been taken in to be cared for and sustained because there was no one left in their family to do so. And yet when these children sang, joy radiated out of every pore of their being. I mean, they beamed smiles and energy and danced and sang to the glory of God with everything they had. Well, I had the chance to see them several times while they were touring in the country, and one of those times we had the opportunity to hear them speak. The person who was presiding asked them some questions, and one of the questions that he asked was, "What do you want to do when you grow up? Who do you want to be when you grow up?" And these children, to the person, said, "If I grow up, I want to be a doctor. If I grow up, I want to be a teacher. If I grow up, I want to be someone who helps others." Well, the person I was sitting next to turned to me and said, "Are they saying if? Are they saying if?" And they were. For these were children who knew that life was not certain. They knew the terrors of war. They knew the ravages of poverty. And yet these were children with a hope for the future. And as they had that hope for the future that allowed them to dream, they were living in to a future that was being made real in their lives, living into something that was far beyond the present turmoil that they had experienced. You know, we practice this in our faith as well. We practice it and learn it from our Jewish brothers and sisters in the celebration of Passover. Passover is a meal that is intended to literally share the stories of Thanksgiving from generation to generation. So the stories are told for the children to hear how God has been faithful in the past so that they know how to aim their life for the future. There's a prayer in that service that has always been meaningful to me. It's called the 18NOV. The phrase that recurs over and over again is, "It would have been enough." It would have been enough. There are 15 phrases in that prayer, phrases that have to do with words of thanksgiving for being released from slavery. 5 phrases that have to do with the miracles of God's providing grace. 5 miracles, 5 stanzas of being thankful for the opportunity to be in God's presence. So the words are like this: if God had only delivered us from slavery, it would have been enough. If God had only provided manna in the desert, it would have been enough. If God had only parted the Red Sea for us to cross safely, it would have been enough. If God had only given us the Sabbath, it would have been enough. And it cultivates that sense of awareness of God's faithfulness in so many ways in the life of the people over time. And it becomes a word that isn't about how God has been faithful in the past and something that happened long ago and far away to someone else. It cultivates a sense of how God continues to be faithful in the present, and that each act that God gives to us, each act of compassion, of love, of mercy, any one of them would have been enough, for us to know of God's faithfulness. We practice it in our worship in the great Thanksgiving when we gather at the communion table, when we rehearse God's faithfulness over time. We know it matters to recall how God has acted in the past, to shape our confidence in how God will act in the future, so that we can stay faithful, acting in the present. It is the power of remembering, that opens the door for us to dream for the future and to sustain through the present. I think that's especially true, and it's especially ironic that our expressions of thanksgiving often come out of times of deep despair, comes out of time of fear, of uncertainty. We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. We just sang those words. But did you hear the rest of that phrase? The wicked oppressing now cease from distressing. These folks were gathering together to ask the Lord's blessing, not because life had been easy, but because they had been sustained through life's difficulties, because they were now moving on to a new reality. We have an affirmation that God continues to act, even in the darkest of moments. Some people read the psalm that we heard this morning that talks about sowing with tears. And they read it in this way, and I love this. They say it may well be that the tears that fell as they were sowing served as the water source for the planting and harvesting of the future. Can you imagine our tears serving as the water source for the future harvest that brings shouts of joy? You know, we may look back with rose-colored glasses sometimes and hope for the good old days. But I think what the scriptures say to us is the good old days haven't always been so great, but our God has always been faithful. And because of that, we can trust that our God is planting a new harvest and that there will be new ways in the future for us to reap and to fill our mouths with shouts of joy. This week we will gather around a table. Many of us will gather with friends or with family. We'll gather together to pause and ask the Lord's blessing. And part of what we will do is tell the stories of God's faithfulness in the past. Oh, I hope we tell those stories, because those are the stories that will open us to God's faithfulness in the future. And as we rehearse those stories together, other stories become our stories, and we are sustained by God's faithfulness to the community. And as we rehearse those stories, as we look and give thanks for God's faithfulness, then we may find ourselves open to seeing God's faithfulness in the present and in the future, in unexpected places, in unexpected times, like in a stable in Bethlehem, or at an empty tomb, or in those places of weeping in our own lives, or maybe at a Thanksgiving table.